They say a woman's reputation in London is a glass figurine. It takes years to shape, seconds to shatter, and the man who drops it rarely bothers to sweep up the pieces. Lord Prentice Carew did not drop Maren Holloway's accidentally. He placed it at the edge of the shelf, looked her in the eye, and pushed. For 3 seasons, 3 full, wretched, silk and candlelight seasons, he had whispered the same elegant poison into the ears of drawing rooms from Mayfair to Bath. Miss Holloway, he would say, in that voice of his that always arrived dressed as reluctant concern, is rather a complicated creature. Warm enough at first, but there is something in her that resists affection. I tried. God knows I tried. A sorrowful shake of the head, a long, meaningful pause, and every matron in the room would nod and tuck that small, a cruel verdict away like a pressed flower, flat, preserved, and produced at every possible occasion. Maren was 22 the first time he said it. She was 25 the night she finally believed him. It was the Harrington Ball, the grandest crush of the season, and she had arrived dressed in deep garnet silk because her dearest friend Theodora had declared the colour made her look like consequence. Maren had laughed when she said it. By midnight, the laughter had long since gone cold. Prentice was there. He was always there, at every gathering she attended, as though absence would rob him of the quiet satisfaction of watching his work take hold. He stood near the card room with Lord Selwyn and 2 gentlemen Maren did not recognise, and though she caught only fragments of his words above the orchestra, she heard enough. Still unmarried, 3 seasons now, that should tell you everything. The gentleman laughed and turned away. Maren stood at the edge of the dance floor, her glass of champagne growing warm in her hand, and the thought settled over her with the weight of something long dreaded finally arrived. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I am the sort of woman men do not love. That was the precise moment the Duke of Havelock walked through the door, and absolutely nothing in Maren Holloway's life was the same again. He did not drift toward her the way men sometimes did, cautiously, with one eye already scanning the room for an easier conversation. The Duke of Havelock moved through the Harrington Ballroom the way weather moves, with absolute indifference to everything standing in its path. Maren noticed him before he noticed her. It would have been impossible not to. Adrian Coventry, 4th Duke of Havelock, was the kind of man who rearranged a room simply by entering it. Tall, dark-coated, with the unhurried authority of someone who had never once been asked to wait, he paused at the threshold and let his gaze travel the length of the ballroom with the dispassion of a general surveying terrain. Then his eyes found her. Not the chandelier, not the dancers, not the glittering press of London's finest. Her, standing alone at the edge of the floor in garnet silk, holding a glass of warm champagne like a woman bracing for impact. He crossed the room. Every head turned. Maren felt the shift in the room's attention the way one feels a draught, a sudden collective chill as necks craned and fans stilled, and she had precisely 4 seconds to decide whether to flee or stand her ground. She stood her ground, barely. He stopped before her and inclined his head, not the shallow dip of obligation, but a slow, deliberate bow that somehow managed to suggest she had earned it. "Miss Holloway?" His voice was low, measured, carrying the quiet confidence of a man unaccustomed to being ignored. "I don't believe we have been introduced. I find I am no longer willing to let that stand." Maren looked up at him. In the amber wash of candlelight, his expression was composed, watchful, and entirely focused on her face, as though the 300 people surrounding them had simply ceased to exist. "You have the advantage of me, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Adrian Coventry." A pause. "And I suspect the advantage has been yours all evening." It was not a compliment, precisely, or rather, it was the kind that arrived disguised as an observation, leaving the recipient uncertain whether to be flattered or dissected. Maren chose neither. "That is a curious opening," she said, "for a man who crossed a ballroom uninvited." Something in his expression, not amusement exactly, but its more dangerous cousin, stirred just beneath the surface. "I was invited by the Harringtons. I simply chose my destination independently." "And your destination was me." "And my destination was you," he agreed, without the faintest trace of apology. Maren had spoken to dukes before. She'd even charmed one or two of them in the brief window of her first season, before Prentice had begun his quiet, meticulous work of undermining her. And she knew how these conversations were supposed to proceed: the circling pleasantries, the careful flattery, the studied indifference that men of rank deployed like armour. Adrian Coventry was not doing any of that. He was simply looking at her with the unguarded directness of a man who had long since stopped pretending that social performance interested him, and the experience was profoundly disorienting. "People will talk," she said at last, mostly to fill the silence before it grew any more unnerving. "People talked before I arrived," he replied evenly. "I noticed." The champagne glass grew cold in her hand. "What, precisely, did you notice?" He did not look away. "Carew, near the card room, and the way you heard him from 20 feet away and did not move, not because you lack the will to, but because you refused to give him the satisfaction of watching you leave." The accuracy of it hit her somewhere behind the ribs, sudden and unwelcome as a stumble on a familiar stair. She had thought no one was watching. She had been so certain no one was watching. "You observe a great deal for a man who only just arrived," she said, her voice admirably steady. "I observe everything," the Duke said quietly. "It is both my gift and my considerable inconvenience." By the following morning, all of London knew that the Duke of Havelock had spent 40 minutes in conversation with Miss Maren Holloway at the Harrington ball. Theodora Fenn arrived at Maren's doorstep before 9 o'clock, hat still unpinned and eyes wide with the particular energy of a woman carrying news too large to contain. "He danced with no one," Theodora announced, dropping into the chair across from Maren's breakfast table without preamble. "Not Lady Weston, not either of the Granville sisters. He spoke only to you, and then Lord Pembury, and then he left. The room is absolutely demolished." Maren poured her tea with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "He introduced himself. We spoke. It was a conversation, not a declaration of war." "In this city," Theodora said gravely, "those are often the same thing." She was not wrong. By afternoon, 3 separate callers had found reason to mention, with elaborate casualness, that the Duke of Havelock was said to be considering the season's prospects with renewed interest. Each of them watched Maren's face as they said it, searching for the flush of gratification that would confirm everything delicious they suspected. Maren gave them nothing, as she had spent 3 years learning to give nothing away. What she did not give away was this: she had slept poorly. Not because the encounter had unsettled her, though it had, but because she could not stop turning over what he had said. "People talked before I arrived. I noticed. He had seen Prentice. He had seen her hear him. He had crossed a crowded room not in ignorance of her circumstances, but in full and deliberate awareness of them. That troubled her more than any flattery could have, because flattery she knew how to refuse. She had built a very sturdy wall against it over 3 hard seasons, and it held beautifully. But someone who paid attention, someone who saw, that was a different matter entirely. That required a different kind of defence, and she wasn't at all certain she had one ready. The second encounter was not arranged. That, at least, was what Maren told herself afterward, though she was honest enough in the private court of her own conscience to admit she had accepted Lady Dunmore's literary afternoon with full knowledge that Adrian Coventry's aunt was its hostess. He was there, as she had half suspected and half dreaded, standing near the window of Lady Dunmore's library with a volume held loosely in one hand. Not reading it, she noted, simply holding it, the way a man holds something when he wants something to do with his hands while his mind is elsewhere. His mind was, once again, on her. He looked up the moment she entered. Lady Dunmore introduced them formally, with the arch pleasure of a woman who had been engineering social collisions for 50 years and knew exactly what she was doing. Maren curtsied. Coventry bowed. The room observed. They ended up, by the architecture of the afternoon and no visible manoeuvring on either side, in the same quiet corner near the second bookcase. "You came," he said, without preamble. "Lady Dunmore's literary afternoons are well regarded," Maren returned. "They are dreadful, and we both know it." He turned a page of the book without looking at it. "You came anyway." She should have deflected. She was very good at deflecting. Instead, she said, "So did you." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. "So I did." They stood in silence for a moment, and it was not the suffocating silence of two strangers with nothing to say. It was the careful, weighted quiet of two people deciding how honest to be. "Why did you cross the room?" she asked. Not the room. He knew which one she meant. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you looked like someone who had been told very convincingly a lie about herself, and I find I have a strong objection to convincing lies." Maren said nothing. Her throat had done something inconvenient. "Don't mistake that for heroism," he added, almost gently. "It is simply a preference." It took Prentice Carew 8 days to understand that something had changed. To his credit, if credit was a thing a man of his habits deserved, he noticed sooner than most would have. He had always been observant. It was, in fact, the quality that made him so effective at what he did. He understood people, understood the precise social pressure required to diminish them, and he had applied that understanding to Maren Holloway with the patience and care of a craftsman who took genuine pride in his work. He had not expected the Duke of Havelock. Coventry was not by nature a man who involved himself in the social theatre of the season. He appeared, occasionally, like a comet, brilliant, brief, and utterly indifferent to the damage he left in his wake, and then retreated to his estate in Wiltshire for months at a stretch. He did not court. He did not pursue. He certainly did not single out unmarried women at public balls and then appear at the same literary afternoons 4 days later. Unless, Prentice reasoned coldly, someone had made themselves worth singeing out. He found his opportunity at the Morley Musicale, where Maren arrived with Theodora Fenn, and the quiet composure she had been wearing lately like a new garment, better fitted than anything she'd worn before. He positioned himself near Lord Selwyn and waited until Coventry's name arose naturally in conversation, which it did within minutes, because it always did. "Remarkable choice," Prentice said, with the precise weight of a man choosing his words out of charitable reluctance. "Coventry is not known for his endurance of temperament, particularly with women who require, how to say it, a considerable degree of managing." Lord Selwyn raised an eyebrow. "You suggest Miss Holloway?" "I suggest nothing," Prentice said smoothly. "I only know her rather better than most." Across the room, Maren had not heard a word of it, but the room had. It was raining by the time the Morley Musicale drew to its close, a cold, insistent April rain that turned the street outside into black mirror and sent guests crowding toward the entrance in a press of damp wool and impatience. Maren found herself, by the compression of the crowd, standing beside Adrian Coventry at the edge of the vestibule, both of them watching the rain with the private forbearance of people who had learned not to expect the weather to accommodate them. He spoke again tonight, Coventry said. Not a question. Maren kept her eyes on the rain. He speaks every night. That is what he does. And it no longer troubles you? She was quiet for a moment, listening to the drum of water against stone. It troubles me precisely as much as it always has, she said at last. I have simply become better at wearing the expression of a woman it does not trouble. He turned then, and she felt the weight of his attention settle over her, not oppressively, but with the deliberate warmth of a fire lit against cold. How long? He asked. She knew what he was asking. Not how long has he been speaking, how long have you been carrying it? 3 seasons, she said. The words came out steady, which surprised her. He courted me. Briefly. I was foolish enough to believe it was sincere. She paused, and the rain filled the space where the rest of that sentence belonged. When I ended it, he decided that the most elegant revenge was not anger, it was pity. Coventry said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a carriage wheel hissed through a puddle. You ended it, he said finally, and there was something deliberate in the way he emphasized those words, as though he was correcting a record he found profoundly unsatisfactory in its original form. I ended it, Maren confirmed. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, grave, intent, and threaded through with something that looked, dangerously, like fury held at a very controlled distance. Then everything he has said, Adrian Coventry said quietly, is not the observation of a man who knew you. It is the project of a man you refused. The truth of it, spoken plainly aloud for the first time in 3 years, was very nearly more than she could hold. Maren had rehearsed this story in the privacy of her own mind so many times, had turned it over, examined it, made peace with its rougher edges, that she had begun to believe it no longer had power over her. She was wrong, hearing it reflected back in someone else's voice, stripped of all the careful framing she had constructed around it, made it new and raw again. You are very perceptive, she said quietly, for someone who has known me a fortnight. 10 days, he corrected, and a thread of dry warmth ran beneath the precision of it. And I was perceptive about Carew within the first 30 seconds. The rest of the time I have been learning you, learning her, not studying, not observing, learning as though she were a language worth the difficulty of acquisition, not a problem to be filed away and managed. She turned to face him fully then, because the rain showed no sign of relenting, and she was done. She decided with performing composure she did not entirely possess. What is it you want, Your Grace? She asked, direct, unadorned. Not tonight, in general. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had asked himself the same question, and arrived, unhurriedly, at an answer. To be in rooms where you are, he said, for the foreseeable and indefinite future. It was not a declaration. It was not a proposition. It was simply the truth, offered without theatre, and it reached her in the way that only plain things can, past every defence she had built, and straight to the unguarded place beneath. Outside, the rain fell on. The following week arrived carrying the warmth of late April, and with it, an invitation neither Maren nor Coventry had engineered. A country party at the Dunmore estate in Surrey, 3 days of rides and garden dinners, and the particular social alchemy that occurs when London people are removed from London's watching eyes. Theodora declared it provenance. Maren called it coincidence. In her quieter moments, she called it neither. Surrey received them on a Friday afternoon with pale sunshine and the smell of turned earth. Maren shared a carriage with Theodora and arrived to find the house already half full, and Coventry in the entrance hall speaking with his aunt, who released him the moment Maren crossed the threshold with the unseemly speed of a woman who had been waiting. What followed over those 3 days was not courtship in any formal or legible sense. There was no public declaration of intent, no choreographed promenade designed for observation. What there was instead was simply him and her and the gradual, unannounced accumulation of moments. He rode beside her on the Saturday morning, when most of the party was still at breakfast, and they spoke for 2 hours on subjects entirely removed from society: his estates, her opinions on landscape, the relative merits of solitude, the things people sacrifice in order to be considered agreeable. She told him she had once, at 19, nearly accepted a post as a companion in Edinburgh, rather than endure another season. He told her he had spent most of his 28th year in correspondence with no one because it had seemed, at the time, preferable to the alternative. Which was, she asked, rooms full of people performing at each other. She understood him precisely, and the understanding itself felt like something rare and slightly dangerous. A recognition between two people who had each assumed, for long enough to begin believing it, that they were simply better suited to being alone. That evening at dinner, seated 4 places apart, she caught him watching her laugh at something Theodora said. He did not look away when she noticed. Neither did she. Prentice Carew arrived on Sunday. He had not been on the original guest list. Lady Dunmore, upon learning of his addition through Lord Selwyn's casual inclusion, had been too well bred to rescind the invitation, but not too politic to conceal her displeasure. She received him in the drawing-room with the warmth of a woman counting the days until his departure. Maren saw him from the garden. She had been walking with Coventry along the path beside the rose-beds, not arm in arm, but close enough that the distance between them was a choice, not a default. When she looked up and found Prentice watching them from the drawing-room window, even at that distance she could read the recalibration happening behind his eyes, the slow, cold reassessment of a man who had underestimated the situation and was now adjusting his instruments accordingly. "He is here," she said. Coventry did not look toward the window. He was watching her face. "I know. Selwyn mentioned it this morning." "You didn't tell me." "I was deciding," he said carefully, "whether to handle it before or after you knew." She stopped walking. "And what does handling it look like?" He met her gaze with the level calm of a man who had been considering this for longer than this morning. "It looks like whatever you want it to. This is your story, Maren. I am not here to write the ending for you. I am only here to make certain you have someone standing beside you while you write it yourself." The use of her given name, unceremonious and unhurried, landed somewhere between her collarbones and would not leave. She looked at the window again. Prentice was gone. "Then stay close," she said. "Always," he replied. Prentice made his approach on Sunday evening, during the after-dinner hour when the men rejoined the women in the drawing-room, and the candles were lit against the coming dark. He chose his moment with the practiced instinct of a man who understood that the most effective weapons are deployed in company. "Miss Holloway?" He materialized at her elbow with a glass of port, and an expression assembled for the benefit of the surrounding room. Warm, nostalgic, the face of a man revisiting a fond memory. "It has been too long. You look remarkably well." "Lord Carew." Her voice was even, pleasant, and utterly without welcome. He leaned slightly closer, just enough to suggest intimacy to observers. "I confess I was surprised to see you here. With Coventry." A pause waited with implication. "I do hope he has been candid about his history. He is not, shall we say, a man whose attentions have proven consistent." The barb was exquisitely constructed. Concern dressed as friendship, warning dressed as care. Maren looked at him with the calm expression she had spent 3 years perfecting, and then said something she had never, in all those 3 years, allowed herself to say. You are speaking, she said pleasantly, but at full volume, as though your own history recommends you as an authority on the subject. She tilted her head with the grace of a woman entirely in possession of herself. It does not. The room did not go silent. Rooms rarely do in the way stories suggest, but conversation dimmed and heads turned, and Prentice Carew's pleasant expression underwent a structural failure that no amount of recovery could fully conceal. He said nothing. Marin excused herself and walked to where Coventry stood by the fireplace. She did not look back. She was done looking back. It was Theodora who told her, 3 days after Surrey, what was being said. Not Prentice this time. Prentice had been notably quiet since Sunday evening. His silence the particular quality of a man reassessing his losses. This was different. This was the natural machinery of London society, turning with the momentum of weeks of observed behaviour, and what it was producing was, for the first time in 3 years, not cruel. They are saying, Theodora reported, with the barely suppressed delight of someone delivering excellent intelligence, that Coventry intends to call on your uncle. Marin set down her embroidery. My uncle. Formally? Theodora's eyes were bright. With intent. The room took on a quality of stillness that had nothing to do with the absence of noise. Marin sat with the information the way one sits with a letter one has not yet opened, aware that inside it is something that will change the shape of everything, and needing just one more breath before the breaking of the seal. He has not spoken to me, she said finally. No, Theodora agreed. I believe he intends to speak to you first. I believe the call on your uncle is contingent on your answer. That night, Adrian Coventry came to call at the hour just before dinner, was shown into the drawing room, and dismissed the maid with a look. He stood across the room from Marin and did not perform. He did not prepare a speech, he simply said, he, and with the directness she had come to understand, was not coldness but honesty stripped of all its decorative excess. I find I cannot think of the rest of my life without placing you in it. That is not a comfortable discovery for a man who preferred his life tidy. But there it is. Marin breathed in slowly. That is not a proposal. No, he said. It is a confession. The proposal is, will you allow me the extraordinary privilege of making you difficult to leave? Outside, London hummed and rattled and did not notice. Inside, Marin Holloway said yes. They were married in June at the small church in Wiltshire that sat at the edge of the Havelock estate, with Theodora Fenn weeping in the front pew and Lady Dunmore occupying the pew behind her with the satisfied expression of a woman whose interference had proven entirely justified. London received the news the way London receives everything it did not engineer itself, with a brief electric astonishment, followed by the rapid and thorough revision of every opinion previously held. Women who had nodded along to Prentice Carew's quiet assessments now recalled with great clarity that they had always found Miss Holloway rather remarkable. Marin found she had no interest in their revision. She had spent 3 years seeking a verdict from a city that had never been qualified to issue one, and she was finished with the occupation. What she was not finished with, what she discovered over the months that followed she had barely begun, was the education of loving a man who had spent his whole life being watched and never once truly seen. Adrian was not easy. He was private in ways that required patience, and exacting in ways that required confidence, and on at least 3 notable occasions in their first year, he said the wrong thing with the absolute conviction of a man who had not yet learned that being right and being kind are separate skills. But he was present, entirely, exhaustingly, wonderfully present, in the way that some men simply are not, cannot be, do not know how to be. He noticed everything. He remembered everything. He chose her every morning, not with grand pronouncement, but with the steady, undramatic constancy of a man who has made a decision and does not revisit it. That, Maren decided, was its own form of extravagance. The autumn after their marriage, Maren saw Prentice Carew once more. It was at a concert in the city, the kind of event that still drew all of London into the same gilded room, and she saw him across the hall before he saw her. He was standing near the entrance with two men she did not recognise, and he was thinner than she remembered, with a certain quality about him she could not immediately name. Then she could. He was trying to claim the room's attention, and finding with each passing minute that it was not being offered. He had spoken one woman out of London's good graces so deftly that he had never noticed the reputation bleeding onto his own hands. By now, what people remembered was not Maren's supposed difficulty. It was Prentice's campaign against her, which looked rather different now that she stood in a ballroom on the arm of a duke who crossed rooms for her. The sympathy had migrated, as sympathy tends to do when the story reaches its conclusion, and what he was left with was the dim, residual pity of a man who had been very clever in a direction that ultimately served no one, least of all himself. He caught sight of her then. Their eyes met across the hall, only for a moment, the briefest beat, and Maren did not look away first. She simply held his gaze with the equanimity of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to prove to him. Then Adrian's hand found the small of her back, warm and unhurried, and she turned toward the music. She did not look back. She never did again. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath at a ball in Mayfair, or standing in the rain outside a musicale in April, then I hope it has found you well, wherever you are in the world. Please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It amazes me to know how far these stories travel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who has been told, perhaps too many times, that they are difficult to love. They are not. And somewhere, in a crowded room, someone is already crossing the floor,